Have you ever listened to the anthem of the Marine Corps and wondered why there's a line in there about marching to the shores of Tripoli? Or did you ever go to the town of Amboise along the Loire Valley in France, to the castle where Leonardo da Vinci spent the last years of his life, and wondered how come there are some Muslim tombs in there, in a royal palace from the Renaissance? Well, the answer is pirates. Well, a bit more than that. Stay tuned as we explore the French colonization of Algeria.
The halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we find our country's battles in the air.
Algeria, in the 19th century, would have been a semi-autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire. We had a previous video on the Ottoman Empire, so you already know that this is an empire centered on what is today Turkey, that began in the 1200s, lasted up until the 1920s, reached its peak in the 15 and 1600s, and then went through a long period of decline. So by the 1800s, when our story takes place, the Ottoman Empire would already be known as the sick man of Europe. So that allowed some faraway corners of the empire, specifically the north coast of Africa, to live pretty much on their own. These would be known as the Barbary states of North Africa. Today's Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. The leaders of those states would be known as the Dey, D-E-Y, or sometimes the Bey, B-E-Y. Technically officials of the Ottoman Empire, in practice kind of like the local rulers. The population over which they ruled would be a mix of Berbers, also known as Kabyles, Arabs, Turks like themselves, but also a significant Jewish minority. What kind of trade were they in? Well, some agriculture. The northern part of Algeria is a Mediterranean climate, so any kind of crop that you associate with Southern California or Italy or Greece would grow there. Olive trees, grapes, and beyond that, some commerce with neighboring areas. But one thing that was a bit more exciting for our purposes would be piracy. And I'm not talking here about pirates like Johnny Depp in the Caribbean in the 1710s or 1720s. No, I'm talking here about the Barbary pirates, as they were called, from the Barbary coast of North Africa. The way that would work in that these would be Muslim pirates, where the Dey of Algiers would issue a jihad, a holy war against infidels passing by, as a way to justify any kind of attack on passing ships. It's really piracy, but it looked like a religious war. Most of the ships passing by would be either American or European, so there's a religious element to it, with Muslim pirates attacking Christian ships. At that point, they would steal the cargo, obviously, the way pirates do, and the ship, but also, in some cases, enslave the crew. This is one of the rules in the Quran. If you capture people, infidels, in a holy war, you can enslave them. Some of these would then be very badly mistreated, so that created some tensions between Algeria, Europe, and North America. So how do you protect yourself? Well, one way would be to offer tribute to the Dey of Algiers or the Dey of Tripoli or all the Barbary rulers. And that was part of the game. Think of it as like a mafia protection racket. That you threaten to burn down the pizzeria, but if you pay off the mafia don, then you'll be okay with that. So a lot of countries just paid it up rather than see their crews enslaved. That was the case of the United States, for example, which in the early days of the American Republic would simply pay protection money every year to the Barbary Coast pirates. This bothered Thomas Jefferson a lot when he was president. So one of the things he did was to start a war against the Barbary Coast pirates. These are called the Barbary Wars. And even though you might know US history very well, that might be a war you don't know too well. And that's where we get that line in the Marine Corps answer about marching all the way to the shores of Tripoli. Those wars were actually frustrating, so much so that the first one, Jefferson just abandoned it, thinking that it actually cost more money to wage the war than just to pay tribute. Then he went back to paying tribute and decided, no, we need to defeat those pirates once and for all and stop paying protection money like that. And you'll be happy to know, as American patriots, that the Second Barbary War was successful. And so the United States no longer pays protection money to the pirates of North Africa. In this section, as we try to figure out why European powers acquired so many colonies in the 19th century, we ask the question of motive. And usually it's a combination of economic factors, national security, greed, prestige, something of that nature. And so it's the case with Algeria. Clearly, some European powers like France might be interested in an area in North Africa with a climate similar to the French Riviera, nearby with land for the taking. Clearly, there might have been also a religious component, as a mostly Catholic nation like France would be at war with a mostly Muslim nation like Algeria. And then there's a national security aspect that French ships, just like the ships of other European powers, might be targeted by pirates from the Barbary coast. But there is one more thing, and that's a matter of prestige. Let me walk you through the fly swatter incident of 1827. It began when two Jewish merchants in Algeria, who were Algerian nationals, complained that they had sold some grain to the French government and they claimed had never been paid fully. So the Dey of Algiers, Hussein was his name, summoned the French ambassador to tell him, here are two Jewish merchants from my country, you haven't paid them, so you should pay the full amount. The French ambassador insisted that the French government had paid the full amount, and so people disagreed on the matter. And normally when you disagree in the world of diplomacy, it's very toned down. You're wearing a frock, you use forms of politeness. Even when you declare war, you do that with a smile and a please and a thank you. But things got very heated that day, to the point where the Dey of Algiers, Hussein, grabbed a fly swatter from one of his slaves and hit the French ambassador with it. And you might be laughing right now, but you shouldn't, because that's a major diplomatic dispute. Honor is a big matter in the 19th century. This is a time when still people make duels when their honor is insulted. You might make a "you mama" joke to one of your friends and they don't take it too well, and next thing you know, it's meet me at dawn with your witnesses, pistols at 30 paces. Things would be even worse if you're an ambassador, because now the honor of the country that you're representing would be at stake. And people do fight wars in the 19th century for matters of national honor. One example involving France would be the pastry war of 1830-something, where one French pastry shop in Veracruz, Mexico, was attacked by a local mob. The French government did not take it too well, and that led to a war between France and Mexico over croissant. It's actually called the pastry war. And you have multiple examples there. I'm hopping on the French today, but this type of gunboat diplomacy on matters of national honor was pretty typical in the 19th century. And so getting back to Algeria, the French king, his name was Charles X, thought that he could not let the matter slide. He was getting a bit unpopular back at home, and so there was a matter of boosting his popularity. So he insisted that the Dey of Algiers issue a formal apology, which Hussein would not do. And so the French government began a blockade of Algiers to punish him. And still, Hussein would not budge. So the blockade went from 1827 into 1828, 29, 1830. And so this dispute, which had become a matter of prestige and honor from France because of the fly swatter incident, got even worse, because now for 3 years you've been blockaded at a pirate chief in North Africa, and somehow you can't make him cry uncle. And I'll go quickly over the internal situation in France in the 19th century. It's just one revolution after another. But there's one in 1830. So the French king was really desperately trying to defend his honor during that period. And so the way he defended his honor was to order his army to just land troops in Algiers and just take over the city. And eventually this turned into an outright invasion of the whole country in 1830. And that's how you start from the matter of a fly swatter incident and one very angry French ambassador all the way to the invasion of Algeria. What's funny about that invasion is that Algeria was taken really by France by happenstance. But it turned out to be the most valuable of all the French colonies over the next 100 years. And one country that France was really, really attached to until it was lost in the War of Independence in 1954 to 62. So the next question you have when it comes to colonization is not just a matter of motive, but also a matter of impact. Was colonization a kind of civilizing mission that brought benefits to the people being colonized, or was it something more exploitative? And history tends to be a complicated story, so you can often find a bit of both, and that's the case of Algeria. On the strategic level, the French imposed their will on Algerians, much against their will. And in fact, the Algerians fought back. Their main leader in that purpose was a man called Abdelkader, who is viewed by many Algerians as kind of the father of the modern nation and a hero. He was a devout Muslim, but also a good ruler in the area of Algeria that he controlled, masterful strategist who would tie down something like half of the French army in some endless guerrilla war, and also a well-run individual who wrote poetry and was an accomplished horseman, and in fact wrote a treatise on how to raise Arabian horses. So the whole package, ladies. After something like 10 years or so of guerrilla fighting against the French, he was defeated, captured, and sent to France. He was housed in a castle at Amboise, which is why you have all these Muslim tombs over there. Not of Abdelkader himself, but more his relatives and servants and so forth. Some of them died in captivity in the town of Amboise. Abdelkader was eventually pardoned and released, and he spent the last few years of his life in Damascus, in Syria, where amazingly he became quite friendly with the French, despite all the history of tension that he had with them. And late in his life, when there was some outbreak of violence against Europeans and Christians, including French people, he went out of his way to defend the Christian minority in Damascus. For his role, the French eventually gave him the Legion of Honor, which is the highest medal that you can get in France, quite amazingly for a man who had made his name fighting against the French occupation of Algeria. The question of whether the colonization of Algeria was beneficial to the Algerians or not is a matter of great importance today and also great controversy. As we'll see in a later lecture, there was a bitter war of independence between the Algerians and France, so they kind of disagree on what the French record was. I'll try to be as balanced as I can be as a French person. Economically, the French did bring some development to Algeria, which, remember, was kind of a backwater corner of the Ottoman Empire before. So the French brought new forms of agriculture that were more modern, fertilizing, breeding, and so forth, and really developed the agriculture of Algeria, specifically the wine industry, which used to be undeveloped in a predominantly Muslim country, but really took off under the French rule. You can really see the contrast between the Kasbah in Algiers, which would be the traditional Muslim quarter, which looks kind of antiquated by comparison with no running water, electricity, and next to it, the more modern European quarters and the boulevard that would look just like any Parisian boulevard. So there's a lot of progress in that regard. But those economic benefits would not always be split equally. Many of the farmers in Algeria, the local Muslim farmers, would have lost their land during the time of the French invasion. Maybe they had supported Abdelkader and then their land was confiscated. So they found themselves after the war as more of a day laborer looking for employment, often on what used to be their own family farm, which had now been given to a French settler. And so they would be now working as a field hand in what used to be their own land. So there was a big gap between the people known as the indigènes, the indigenous people, the local Muslim Algerians, and the people known as the pieds noirs, which is kind of a French slang term for French settler in Algeria. That's true for the men, but also for the women. Many of the women would have been employed as maids and nannies and au pairs in a much wealthier French household. And that kind of economic gap would lead to resentment in the long run. There was also a political gap, because Algeria was not just any colony. When it was first taken over, it was ruled by the French army, because there was so much fighting for many, many years. But ultimately, as the number of French settlers increased in Algeria, they demanded to be more than a military colony. They wanted equal rights, and eventually to acquire the status of département. And the département in France would be the basic administrative unit. To give a comparison to the US situation, it's like a US state. And Algeria eventually went from being a colony to being one of these départements. And that might seem like a subtle, not that important thing, but it had a great relevance. Think of the difference between, say, Puerto Rico and Hawaii today in the US. Puerto Rico might be a US territory, but it is not a state. So the people who live in Puerto Rico don't fully participate in the production of American law in Congress, or they don't get to vote for president. Hawaii, however, became a US state around, 1958, 59. Now it's a state which has 2 senators in the US Senate and votes in the presidential election and even has some native sons that get to be president of the United States. So Algeria, to use that comparison, started out as a bit like Puerto Rico and ended up like Hawaii today. So that means that the Pieds Noirs, those French settlers in Algeria, and their number eventually reached 1 million. This was the single largest colony of settlement for the French overseas. These Pieds Noirs would be living overseas, but had deputies in Paris and were French nationals in every way, shape, or form. So what's the issue then? Well, the problem is that even though Algeria would be a département, not all the people in there would be full-fledged citizens. Some of them were citoyens, citizens, like the Pieds Noirs, but others were sujets of the empire, subjects. In the same way that, say, a minor below the age of 18 would live in a country and would be subjected to the laws. And so at the political level, you also have that big gap between a minority of the population, about 10%, that is of French descent and has economic and political domination, and a majority of the population that is Muslim, that is in their own land, that is a majority, but yet has a minority of the economic stakes and the political power. When World War I and World War II broke out, France found itself very short on men to fight against the Germans and drafted many men from the colonies. So you'll find a lot of tombs also from Algeria in places like Verdun, the cemetery from World War I. Meaning that all these men in Algeria that were not citizens when it came to voting and so forth, were still considered good enough to be drafted and to die for France, a country that they could not truly be a citizen of. That kind of tension would eventually be resolved by the Algerians making a big claim for independence in the 1950s. But that's a whole other story and a brutal conflict, I'm saying, and that we will study in a whole different video.
The halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we fight our country's battles in the air.